Good day to all. Before we start, I would like to inform all participants that we have interpretation in English, French, and Spanish, which is available for this session. One last housekeeping matter before we move on. If you have questions during the Q&A session later, please send them through the chat box. And then we will review them and respond to them live. So now that all that has been said, let's start. My name is Anouche Derbogossian, and I'm the head of the Trade and Gender Unit in the WTO. And today we will present and launch the WTO database on gender provisions in regional trade agreements. In fact, today we will outline the different types of gender provisions and the commitments made on gender equality in regional trade agreements. This database is one of the 12 gender-responsive policy tools that the WTO Trade and Gender Unit is developing to support WTO members in policymaking, in their trade agreement negotiations on gender. We will also discuss experience from members in negotiating and implementing these provisions and explain the rationale behind these negotiations. So to enlighten us today, we have with us three eminent speakers. First of all, we have Ambassador Molokome from Botswana. She is the chair of the WTO Dispute Settlement and the co-chair of the Informal Working Group on Trade and Gender. We also have Ambassador Cancela from Uruguay, and he's the chair of the Informal Working Group on micro and small and medium enterprises, and he's the coordinator of the Latin American and Caribbean group in the WTO. Last but not least, we have also Lolita Lapin-Forget. She's the Trade and Gender Officer in the WTO, working with me in the unit. And she's actually, I would say, the WTO expert on gender provisions in free trade agreements. She has constructed the WTO database, which I just mentioned, and we will discuss today also. And she has also analyzed all these gender provisions. So this concludes my introduction. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to WTO Ambassador Molokome from Botswana, who will share with us her country's experience in negotiating gender provisions in the Southern African Development Community. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Anouche, and Excellencies, Ambassador, colleague, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me and Botswana, obviously, to participate. We do this happily, as you know, not only in our capacity as one of the three co-chairs, together with Iceland and El Salvador, of the Informal Working Group on Gender, but also because for me, at a personal level, and as a feminist, I do this with pleasure. I would like to congratulate and thank you for organizing this timely and important session in the margins of the WTO Aid for Trade Global Review. As you, ladies and gentlemen, may know already, the objective of this session is to launch the WTO Gender Responsive Trade Agreement Database. It's a long title, otherwise known as the database with a long name, with a view to bring visibility on gender provisions in our regional trade agreements, as well as to highlight the significance of incorporating such provisions in our trade agreement. I will be sharing with you Botswana's experiences in implementing gender-responsive regional and national trade agreements. I will first provide a broader view and linkage at the multilateral and regional level, first through the IWG on trade and gender here at the WTO, and then share with you our experience in Southern Africa at SADC level, sub-regional level, how we have been able to, in the past, I must say we are far ahead in Southern Africa of the WTO, and I think the WTO can learn much from the experience of SADC. As I said, the topic is very dear to me and to my delegation. Botswana is one of the co-chairs of the WTO Informal Working Group on Trade and Gender, a group that was inspired by the Buenos Aires Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment, was concluded, as you know, at WTO's 11th Ministerial Conference in 2017. No less than 118 members out of the 164 total WTO members and observers endorsed the declaration. I know you know this already, but I like to cite it because I think these are good numbers. They committed to reduce trade barriers that contribute to gender inequity. I'm therefore naturally honored to be sitting here and to share some of our experiences as a way, of course, of also encouraging and inspiring others to join us on this good cause. The Informal Working Group on Gender, this is now my marketing pitch for the IWG. I know I'm speaking to the converted because many of you probably are members of the group already. But in the event we have other participants, I hope you will benefit a little bit also from this session because we will tell you a little bit more about the IWG. Our aim is to strengthen efforts to increase women's participation in global trade through sharing of best practices and removing barriers to women's participation in world trade. The IWG seeks to exchange views on how to apply what we call a gender lens to the work of the WTO, to review gender-related reports produced by the WTO Secretariat, and to discuss how women may benefit from the Aid for Trade initiative. I must pause here and allay the fears that I know exist among WTO members, which are that the aim of the IWG is to change rules of the WTO, which I know many member states hold dearly, and quite a few are hesitant to join the working group on that basis. That is not the idea. This is not a JSI, and the IWG on gender is not trying to rewrite any rules. I think the objective really is exactly what we say it is, to make the WTO a more gender responsive organization, not only the Secretariat, but the member states as well at national and regional level, to make sure that the work of the WTO takes fully into account the contributions and different power relations between women and men as they trade and use trade as a way of developing their countries. Really, for me, this is the summary. It is so simple. I sometimes just don't understand how else we could explain it in a way that would persuade the doubting Thomases to understand that we are not trying to rewrite any rules. Because at domestic level, as you know, many of our member states have changed their laws to make sure that women and men are equal. But somehow here at the WTO, it appears there's a certain hesitation to mainstream gender into the work of the WTO. So the work of this session clearly is relevant, and it complements the ongoing work of the group that I've just described on issues related to data collection. And it is one of our priorities as a group. So you will have also heard, those of you who know something about the IWG, that our work is centered around 4 pillars, one of which is research and data, where members review and discuss gender-related analytical work provided by the WTO Secretariat and the work of other organizations in this area, such as the World Bank. We therefore welcome this new development by this Secretariat. I almost said the SADC Secretariat. I used to work for the SADC Secretariat, by the way, to launch the database on gender provisions in regional trade agreements that we call FTAs, in its quest to support member states in implementing the Buenos Aires Declaration and existing regional trade agreements. So let me quickly share with you at the regional level, in Botswana, we are not only a member of the Southern African Development Community, which is one of the so-called building blocks of the African Union, together with ECOWAS in West Africa, the East African Community. So SADC is the Southern African bloc that seeks to build up to the AU. The SADC Secretariat is also based in Botswana, in our country. Maybe I can also brag a little bit that our former President Masire chaired SADC as an organization for 18 years before we had a rotation. So we really did give birth to this regional organization as part of what we call the frontline states during the liberation wars in Southern Africa. So SADC has a strong political flavor, which we as Botswana are proud to host. We at SADC have made great strides, I believe, and commitments to mainstream gender into our program of action and community building initiative as a prerequisite for sustainable development. I always point out, the SADC heads of state did not do this out of doing anybody a favor. We believe in SADC that this is our way of making sure that we move in the direction as a whole region and individual countries towards sustainable development. Our aim, of course, major aim in SADC is to deepen regional integration. SADC converted from being a very political organization, the old SADC with 2 Cs, after the liberation of South Africa, Angola, Zimbabwe, and Namibia, into becoming a more regional integration-based organization. We seek to deepen trade and regional integration between ourselves, but also the 14 member states believe that this can also be achieved by eliminating gender inequalities, because the vast majority of our population, more than half of our population, are women. And those of you who know about African women, Southern African women are no exception. Women in SADC contribute very, very much, not only to their families, to their communities, and to their countries, but to the region in general. The intra-regional trade in SADC is basically female. And I think that this is something that we need to understand. So what did we do to make sure that we don't just recognize this, but we advance the cause of gender equality? As far back as 1998, this is a long time ago. I don't know, some of you may not have been born at this time, or you're still in primary school, through the development of a regional policy and institutional framework for gender that was coordinated from the SADC Secretariat. Upelu is not smiling yet. My expert over here, I don't know where she was, whether she was in preschool. I had the privilege in those days of setting up the gender unit as the inaugural head of that unit at SADC. This was done in the context of the adoption of a regional instrument, the Declaration on Gender in SADC, signed by all SADC member states, and which was monitored through annual reporting at the very highest level, at the summit of the heads of state. So here we are, you have this organization that is aiming at deepening integration between its member states. The organization decides that we would like to do this also simultaneously by ensuring that women's issues and women's empowerment is a tool that we're going to use at the policy and institutional level to achieve development. So this was a non-binding declaration. This is another thing I would like to bring to the attention of fellow member states here at the WTO. Nobody was compelled to do anything. It was not a binding instrument. The declaration said, this is what we aim to do as countries, but we'll do it collectively as a region. We'll learn from each other on best practices, which is exactly what we are doing here, isn't it? We are learning from best practices from each other. And a number of commitments were made, fairly low level, non-binding, to collaborate and cooperate, but it was monitored. I think the important thing is monitoring. So one country could not say, well, this thing is not binding after all. So every year, whenever the SADC summit of head of states met, you could see countries actually falling over each other, competing to show that they had made progress. And all this was done in the context of a political meeting where there would be a report on the political situation, on the economic situation, the big items, and then there would be the report on gender equality. You will not believe what a difference this made to the way policymakers think about gender equality. I just thought I'd share that because for me, that was actually a moment, a revelation, to see that you can create gender awareness that quickly. So when you look at this experience, SADC, of course, then upgraded the declaration from being a non-binding declaration to becoming a binding protocol. Guess why? Because I think the leaders were now seeing, they were now comfortable that this is something that we are committed to. This is something that is deliverable, and therefore there's no reason why we cannot move in the direction of, but they didn't have to. But of course, we have a very strong civil society as well in Southern Africa. We have very strong women's organizations, a regional women's movement that said to the heads of state, look, if you truly believe that women and men are equal and women contribute, move in the direction of making sure that you make binding commitments. And I'm not saying WTO members should do the same, but this is what certainly happened at SADC. So we have a protocol now, which is a binding protocol adopted in 2008. Look, it took another 10 years. And during those 10 years, reporting was done, best practices were shared, laws were amended, and so countries began to feel more comfortable. So the protocol is aimed at providing for the empowerment of women. It's very broad, to eliminate discrimination and achieve gender equality by encouraging and harmonizing the development and implementation of gender-responsive laws, policies, and programs and projects. Article 15 on economic policies and decision-making of the protocol commits SADC member states to ensure that there's equal participation of women and men in policy formulation and implementation of economic policies, and to further ensure gender-responsive and sensitive budgeting at the micro and macro levels, including tracking, monitoring, and evaluation. Very comprehensive. It sounds really good, but it is difficult. I must tell you that these are commitments which countries, your own countries, make in CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and many other. But it is a first step towards recognizing that this is important, that you want to make a difference. Another article further commits SADC member states to adopt policies and enact laws which ensure equal access, benefit, and opportunities for women and men in trade and entrepreneurship, taking into account the contribution of women in the formal and informal sectors. Once again, a very strong point for women in the region, in the sub-region, because the informal sector is where the women dominate, and often the work of entrepreneurs and informers is not recognized as work. So let me move in the direction of winding up and observe that the protocol at SADC, the SADC Gender Protocol, has made a big difference in increasing awareness. I think I've said that already, among member states, policy makers in member states, leading to the adoption of explicit gender policies, laws, and programs to ensure gender equality and mainstreaming gender. This is one of the most important things. Mainstreaming gender into the regional program of action. And as I said, I believe that WTO can learn. They don't have to do it. We don't have to do it exactly the same way here at the WTO, but we need not reinvent the wheel either. And I'm very happy that the DG, when she took over, when she was campaigning, she already made commitments to make sure that the secretariat would be gender sensitive and responsive, that she would strengthen the institutional framework. And this is exactly what happened. From one person in the gender unit who was Anush, we now have 6, I believe, 4 members. So 6 is a wish, okay? So, but we are doing really well, and I would like to commend the DG and appreciate her steps in this direction. At the continental level, I'm sure you've heard about the African Continental Free Trade Area, another long name, but its acronym is AFTA, flagship initiative under the African Union Agenda 2063, which entered into force in 2021 and aims to increase intra-Africa trade and investment. It contains gender equality as an objective. On our continent, you cannot adopt an instrument now without acknowledging the importance of gender equality. And this is thanks to the African women's movement. It is simply not politically correct to do that. So I believe that as African women, we've made a huge contribution. If you read the literature on gender mainstreaming, you're going to find a lot of African women academics and activists that are authors of gender mainstreaming manuals and so on. So I think that this is one way also of making sure that we share experiences in this way. I can refer you to a number of articles in the African Continental Free Trade Area 27.2D, but these speaking notes will be available for you to use. I don't want to bore you with all the exact provisions, but they aim to ensure resource mobilization, collaboration with development partners for implementation of support, domestic efforts by members, to improve export capacity of both formal and informal service suppliers, with particular attention to micro, small, and medium-sized women and youth enterprises. So hopefully, because this is a new agreement, we are hoping that its full implementation will ensure support of women in their different trade-related roles and ensure that the instrument supports inclusive growth for both women and young people. So institutionalizing trade and gender and allocating resources to the cause will ensure meaningful exploitation of the instrument by women entrepreneurs. Let me end by saying a few things about my own country. I know I've said a lot about SADC at the regional level because I think it is a best practice and it's a collective practice. Government of Botswana, as you know, as you will have guessed by now, recognizes that equal access and opportunity for women and men is cardinal to the development process in all aspects of development. Trade is no exception, which was given more impetus by the various UN conferences. I think some of you know about them, to move away from the narrower women and development approach to the gender perspective. Botswana has sought to make some bold changes in its policies, institutionalizing gender in both public and private civil society sectors. And we've tried to transform the legal and administrative landscape to afford women and men equality. We are not there yet. No country is there yet. And we are not an exception, but we try to have programs like the Women's Economic Empowerment Program. That is an integration model of the National Gender Program, which provides seed funding in the form of grants for women's groups to start up businesses and income generating activities. Of course, the program, some of it targets women, but men can also be involved or benefit from it if they partner with women. But the main partner and the person who's funded should be a female in order to level the playing field. It's not that we want to discriminate against men. The program aims to address the beneficiaries' immediate and practical needs as well as long-term and strategic needs. So it tries to be very comprehensive. It seeks to create employment for women through small enterprises, build beneficiaries' capacity on business management, because there's no use giving women grants when you don't train them on how to run their businesses, and expose them to the regional and international markets. So let me say that mainstreaming a gender perspective into all development policies and programs across the entire planning and implementation process is what we need to effect meaningful and sustainable change. For us, this has resulted in the adoption of the policy documents I have referred to. Let me conclude by simply saying that much as no size fits all, I do believe that we can share at both national, regional, and global level to make sure that whatever we are doing, because what we do as a country here and what we do at home and at the regional, sub-regional, and regional level, they are connected. And the WTO, I believe, should take its place, I think, as the premium trade organization in this success or progression towards a greater representation of women in trade. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this very fascinating introduction and for sharing your personal experience and also elaborating a bit on the rationale behind pushing these RTAs to the next level in terms of, especially in terms of fostering gender equality and also the influence of civil society. So that was really, I think, very enriching, and also looking at how the trade and gender is inscribed in the work of the WTO. So now I would like to take you to another continent, actually, and I would like to ask WTO Ambassador Kotsela from Uruguay to give maybe his country's perspective and share his experience in integrating these gender provisions in RTAs. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, Ambassador Molokome, Anush, Lolita, colleagues, friends. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate today with you here. Well, I'm here to talk about the free trade agreement between Chile and Uruguay. And why this free trade agreement? Because this FTA is the first FTA between developing countries, and as far as I know, the only one up to now that includes provisions on gender. So I think it is important that we can share this experience with you all. This free trade agreement between Chile and Uruguay has been protocolized at the Latin American Integration Association, ALARI, as the Economic Complementation Agreement number 73. It entered into force on December 13th, 2018, and it took about 1 year to be negotiated. This bilateral instrument sits on the Economic Complementation Agreement number 35 among the Mercosur parties and Chile. That refers to free trade on goods. So that's the, let's say, the legal basis on which the FTA between Uruguay and Chile is built on. This FTA can be considered a next generation one because the new issues that are addressed in it are comprehensive service commitments, trade facilitation, MIS, e-commerce, labor rules, cooperation, regulatory coherence, transparency and anti-corruption, and last but not least, trade and gender. At that moment, the moment when it was negotiated, it was a novelty to incorporate gender-related provisions in a trade agreement of this kind. And I had to say that there was even part of the public opinion that had manifested concerns at the time over the possible commodification from commodities of such a sensitive subject as gender issues. Nowadays, it is more accepted to talk about those aspects, and traditionally, all these aspects were only considered on political discussions on trade organizations and conversations among countries. But so nowadays, it is more accepted to have them on these kind of instruments. As I said, till this date, it is the only FTA between developing countries that has this kind of provisions. As you know, developed members of these organizations, such as the EU and Canada, for example, they are systematically incorporating the gender lens to their regular trade discussions with their trading partners. So let me briefly refer to the gender and trade chapter of this FTA. That is chapter 14, which is dedicated to boost all those public policies that can help to improve the role of women in international trade, and of course, more specifically between Uruguay and Chile. Article 14.1 contains the general dispositions. The concept of inclusive economic growth is interpreted with gender lens as one of its pillars. Both countries encourage the development of policies and good practices that can enable equality, not only on gender, but that could avoid discrimination based on sex, gender identity, age, religion, public opinions, among other things. Article 14.2 refers to international agreements, and the parties, that is Chile and Uruguay, confirm their interest on keep adopting international instruments that can help to eliminate the salary gap between men and women, that addresses the issues of maternity protection, domestic labor, and shared family responsibilities. Then Article 14.3 relates to cooperation activities. The objective here is to translate the benefits of this FTA to the ground and undertake concrete activities to boost women inclusion in bilateral trade. The primary actors in charge of identifying the priorities will be the governments, the unions, civil society, education institutions, and in principle, the areas that could be addressed are programs to boost the role of women in companies and social environments, better access to technology and education, promotion of financial inclusion, better practices on labor rules, boost female entrepreneurship, health and labor security, development of indicators, methodologies, and statistics with gender lens. In order to achieve these objectives, the parties can undertake workshops, seminars, research, exchange of best practices, and technical assistance. And Article 14.4, I consider in particular this one is a very important one because it creates a specific committee on gender. Ambassador Molokome was talking about monitoring, and this is precisely what this committee is set for, to monitor the fulfillment of the obligation of this agreement, and to assure that even if we have best endeavor clauses, we can monitor them, we can give a follow-up, and we can, to a certain extent, be sure that work is in progress. Which are the duties of this committee? Well, to facilitate the exchange of information and practices to best benefit women in this FTA, to coordinate and evaluate the performance of the bilateral cooperation, and to dialogue with other international organizations, NGOs, or other actors to foster the application of this chapter. This committee should work alongside with the one in charge of cooperation, the Committee on Cooperation that is established on Chapter 13. That's the previous chapter. According to the mandate, the committee had its first meeting on 2021, setting a mechanism of the exchange of data in order to evaluate the actual role of women in the company's part of the bilateral trade between Chile and Uruguay. And a focal point in each country is the responsible part to keep the activities going forward. The agreed program of activities for the period 2021-2022 is as follows. On May 13th, 2021, a workshop on recompilation and assessment of disaggregated data on gender and trade was accomplished. Then it set workshops for women entrepreneurs on technology and digital tools for their businesses. And it was also established a mission of Uruguayan women entrepreneurs to Chile to explore microfinance opportunities. And there was also a networking event with women from both countries. Then we have Article 14.5, 14.6, which established the possibility of having consultations between the two countries. The parties will undertake consultations in case of doubt of interpretation of the text of this chapter, because here the chapter 18, which is the one related to dispute settlement, is not applicable for this particular chapter 14. So the idea was to privilege the dialogue and the consultation between the two parties on how best fulfill these obligations, rather than to submit it to the dispute settlement mechanism of the whole agreement, which we think it's an important innovation of the way we approach to these matters in free trade agreements. From our point of view, this chapter is absolutely innovative, and it's the only one so far that tackles the inequalities of sex on trade in a Uruguayan legal binding trade instrument. And although the language is best endeavor when, there is the commitment to undertake regular activities in the framework of this committee. So really, the first meeting of this body has been a challenge in terms of identifying what kind of issues could be addressed. And this proves the still ongoing difficulties we have to identify and spot quality data on this matter. Uruguay and Chile are two developing countries, very much committed on tackling of all those issues related to trade that can make more tangible its benefits. In the case of Uruguay, the policies in this regard have been implemented for more than a decade now through programs that are very targeted. These programs are basically childcare, microfinance, capacity development, and direct subsidies that are implemented since the early years of this century in order to generate a friendly environment for those women entrepreneurs, which in most cases are from the more challenged social sectors. So, well, I hope that we could provide a general view on the issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for going through the details of the agreement, which I think is very interesting because we see we have trade issues, of course, included in the agreement, obviously. But when it comes to gender, we have these what I call these indirect trade issues that are included. That is to say, for example, access to finance and equal access to education, all these different topics that we here in the WTO often say they are non-trade issues, but actually, if women don't have access to education or don't have access to finance, they cannot benefit from trade. They cannot trade themselves when they are entrepreneurs or female farmers, for example. So I think the broad sense of the agreement is quite interesting to look at. Another point you're making about these statistics with gender lens and getting quality data, I think this is what we are here to present, actually, quality data about what sort of provisions, what kind of provisions are included in regional trade agreements. And I think I would like to turn to you, Lolita. Before we present this database that we've been talking about it for like many months now, and which you constructed, you created, I would like to have maybe to ask for your help, because there are many persistent myths, and even I would say I would call it fake news about these gender provisions that are contained in these agreements, and I really would need to help you deconstruct them for me. So if you're okay with that, of course. Great, excellent. So my first question to you actually is about the beliefs that including gender provisions in RTAs is a new practice, and that they are very few. So do you think this is a fair assessment?
Well, no, Anoush. This is far from being accurate. And to illustrate how it's a fake news, look at the graph. Can we have it on the screen, please? Well, okay, so whatever. So there's a graph showing that the inclusion of provision in trade agreements started in 1957. So 65 years ago. It was in the Treaty of Rome, and it was on gender equal pay. Then 25 years after, in 1993, the second gender provision was included in an African trade agreement. It was the ECAS. And since then, since this first gender provisions in an African trade agreement, we can see that 5 out of 8 of the regional economic communities include such provisions. So it really started. So it started with the Treaty of Rome, but the practice emerged in the African trade agreements. If I can also deconstruct another myth, if you allow, we hear a lot that it is new to have a chapter devoted to trade and gender issues. It's true that it has become trending recently with your agreement, and it marked a turning point as it put on the map the gender the chapter on gender, so it attracted the attention of the whole international communities. Since you concluded this agreement, everyone's talking about that. We know now that parties are interested to include gender provisions in their agreements, but the practice started in the African continent. It was the Commissariat Treaty concluded in 1993, so started way before it became trending. To answer your question, it's not new. If we could have the screen, you would see that there's also a lot of these provisions. Actually, there's 324 gender provisions included in 109 regional trade agreements, which represent the third of the RTAs that are notified and enforced at the WTO. So it's not new. There's not a few. It's a very well-established practice.
That's interesting. So more than 300 provisions in more than 100 agreements, and starting from the late 50s and even more from the 80s and 90s. So I think that's quite, the myth is completely destroyed, I guess, right? So, okay, that's interesting. But I'm hearing a lot about that these provisions are actually concluded between developed countries. I mean, we obviously see with our two ambassadors here that it's not the case. Or another thing that I'm hearing is that these provisions are absolutely imposed by developed countries on developing countries. Do you share that position? Do you share that assessment?
Again, absolutely not. At least this is not what the text of the RTAs indicates. And for 3 main reasons. So it's very unfortunate that you cannot see the map, but you would see that 159 countries are part of at least one RTA with a gender provision. So it's not only a Western practice or a practice that developed countries has started, because I said it started in Africa. So out of these countries, 147 are members of the WTO, which is close to 90% of the membership. So again, it's a very well spread practice. Also, there's 24 trade agreements that are concluded only between developing countries that include a gender provisions. And if I can fly this, is that the other 3/4 of the agreements that there's at least one developed country, several of them include only 1 or 2 mere reference without any binding language, so no binding commitments. So what we have RTAs only between developing countries, only between developed countries, or between developed and developing countries. But these 3 categories can either include specific commitments or no commitments at all. So the development index is far from being an indicator of the commitment for gender equality in trade agreements. And third, a lot of these RTAs between developing countries provide for stronger commitments for gender equality than a lot of RTAs concluded by a developed country. Let's take again, for instance, the example in Africa. So out of 24 RTAs that there's at least 1 African countries, 8 are only between African countries, so intra-African trade agreements. And when we have a look at all these 65 gender provisions, those included in intra-African RTAs covers way more extensively the needs and interests of women than those between an African party and a developed country. So we cannot argue that the practice was imposed by Western countries, because African countries have included gender provision a few years before it started, that this practice was used, or the practice emerged in the developed country RTAs. And also, I will make another point. I think it's very, very important. There are 4 RTAs that include gender equality in the core of the objectives. These RTAs are the AFCFTA, the SADC, as Ambassador Molokome mentioned, and the EAC, and the Treaty of the European Union. So 3 out of 4 are concluded only by developing countries. And putting gender equality at the core of the objective means that the whole agreement would have to be interpreted and implemented in the way to achieve gender equality. So it means a lot. So the question is, who is influencing who?
That's a good question. So maybe we'll have that question at some point in another panel, right? But that's very interesting to see that developing countries are extremely committed, and we have obviously with our two ambassadors here obvious examples of that. So I have two other questions before we present the database, because we talked about this database so many times, but we will show it to you. And all this analysis, by the way, comes from the information Lolita gathered to build this database. So that's also an important thing to outline. So I have a couple of more questions. I was thinking possibly when we were talking about with Ambassador Cancela about these indirect trade issues, these other would call them social issues, many also say that these gender provisions are addressing only these social issues. Do you think that's correct in your view?
Well, not only, no. A wide range of gender issues are addressed in RTAs, and you cannot see on the screen, but like there's plenty of different kind of gender issues that are addressed. Actually, gender issues, social issues represent about a third of the provisions. So it's not the majority, and 2/3 provide for gender equality issues or aim to tackle forms of discrimination against women. Also, 2/3 of the provisions promote for the participation of women's in economic activities. In fact, there are more provisions that address women in the workforce than on gender issues, on social issues. And these kind of provisions on labor issues, either they provide for gender equal pay, elimination of various forms of discrimination, including on pregnant women. They also provide for allowing flexible working conditions for women to be able to balance their personal life or household responsibilities with their career development. Also, we find in let's say in the USMCA that the parties have to develop policies to ensure a free environment, a working environment free from sexual harassment and violence against women. So this is quite ambitious, or not ambitious, but it's quite interesting to see that in a RTA. And lastly, if I can point that too, 1/3 of the RTAs especially target women entrepreneurs, either women involved in exports, women-owned or led businesses. They also provide for or target these women in specific sectors, including fisheries, services, industries, or provide for access to opportunities in the public procurement, digital trade. So there's a lot of provisions that specifically target women entrepreneurs and increase their leadership in the private sectors. So Anush, it wouldn't be accurate to say that RTAs only address women as social agent, mothers, or as part of vulnerable population, as they mostly address women involved in economic activities.
Of course, well, that makes sense to me. And I just want to highlight one thing that you said about violence against women. And it's interesting that you mentioned that there is some provisions that are focusing on that, because we see, for example, in aid for trade programs, that there is a strong growing focus on tackling gender-based violence of women that are in trade. And for example, there are a lot of women, Ambassador Molokome was talking about these cross-border traders. We see there is a lot of violence against them, whether physical or others, that is happening. And I think governments through these RTAs or also through these aid for trade programs really start to look into this more. So that's quite interesting, and maybe we could at some point look at the links. How these provisions on these very specific issues trickle down and impact women really on the ground. So maybe something we'll discuss tomorrow, right? I think we should, right? We'll get back to that in a second. My very last question before we launch or we show you the database. So what about the binding aspect or the enforceable aspect of these gender provisions? What would you say? What would you say about that?
Well, Anush, you ask a very difficult question, or a more difficult question, because there's a lot of nuance that should be made in here. First, now that we have the screen, it's wonderful. We can see that 2/3 of the provisions are under the supervision of a monitoring institution. So the existence of a monitoring institution can foster, to different extent, the accountability of the parties with regards to the full implementation of their commitment that they made in gender provisions. So state parties may have to report on what they have done since the entry into force of the agreement and try to find ways to improve the impact of this provision on women. But in fact, there are only two FTAs in which parties formally commit to report on the implementation of the gender provisions. However, if it's not an obligation, the platform that is provided by this kind of institution, parties will definitely have to say what they have done. So in a way, it is a form of reporting. Again, and you can see on the graph, and this is also a myth that we hear a lot. Actually, 3/4 of the gender provisions are not explicitly excluded from the DSM, the dispute settlement mechanism. Doesn't mean that they can lead to a dispute, but they're not explicitly excluded from it. Actually, that's only 22% of the provisions that are. And again, if I can also say one little nuance here, it's not all gender chapters that are explicitly excluded from the scope of the dispute settlement mechanism. As I mentioned, the chapter on the COMISA and the EAC, so 2 trade agreements concluded by African countries, do not exclude these obligations from the dispute settlement mechanism. So only strictly on legal ground, it could lead to a dispute, but the political motivation, or this is something completely different, but it doesn't explicitly exclude the obligation. There's also the Canada-Israel that the FTAs that doesn't exclude the chapter from the dispute settlement, but they find another way to say that we need the consent of both parties to lead to a dispute. So let's say that one party will not agree, but then it cannot lead to a dispute. However, and this is very, very important, I said, and you can see on the graph, they're not excluded. Gender provisions are not excluded from the dispute settlement mechanism. But when you read the provision, you see that we don't have the requirement to lead to a dispute. We don't have obligation. We don't have commitments. You cannot pursue the other party because you think that the cooperation didn't work or didn't cooperate enough. That's not something that you can do. So actually, there's a very few number of provisions that are legally binding. I can give some example. I think it's very interesting. So as I mentioned, the COMISA, the EAC chapters, they provide for eliminating laws that discriminate against women, and either in. Okay, we're running out of time. Yes, so they agree in a very binding language, they shall eliminate all discriminatory laws against women, and especially with respect of women's access to finance, access to land and other assets. This is binding. We also have a very interesting provision in the USMCA in which members have formally commit to put in place policies to protect women, workers, protect women's workers from discrimination, including on wage. We also have the negative obligation in the RTA negotiated by the UK, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, in which they formally agree or formally commit to not discriminate against women in the context of the domestic services regulation. And we have this kind of provision in the agreement concluded at the WTO. So no, it's not all gender provisions that are not binding. And gender provisions are bound to enforcement mechanism, but the practical aspect to it it's a bit more challenging, I would say.
Great, thank you. So basically, it's the nature of these provisions
Yeah.
that make them non-binding. So that's interesting. Great. So let's launch this database.
Yes, so we discussed about the picture. Now let's present the work. So we developed the database to help members to have access to the information, to select what kind of provisions they want to have based on what it exists. So the purposes was really to further support members to formulate, I would say, more gender responsive trade agreements. And this is part of a set of policy tools that the Trade and Gender Unit offered to members to promote gender equality in trade. So really, it's a one-stop platform on all gender provisions concluded worldwide. So it contains absolutely every provisions, or if I missed one or two, please send a message. But it's supposed to be quite comprehensive. And you have all kind of different information on the database. So what it maps? It maps the plurilateral and bilateral trade agreements that contains gender provisions. Gender provisions are provisions with explicit explicit references to either gender, sex, women.
It's fine.
Wonderful. So yeah, so all these provisions, it includes also all the references to the international instruments on women, so the WTO, Buenos Aires Declaration, SDG 5. So really all these provisions that explicitly mention or explicitly integrate gender issues, or take into consideration gender issue, I should say. So what you can do, you can filter all the provisions based on different factors. For instance, you can select by gender issues, so either culture, gender equality, leadership in decision-making, politics, social issues, and women's participation in economic and development activities. You can also, and for instance, to be more precise in which kind of social issues you're interested about, you can select subcategories that include education, family, food security, health, safety, and that include gender-based violence, human trafficking, sexual exploitation, and social and inclusion for women and vulnerability. Same with the gender issues related to the participation of women in economic activities. So either you want to more focus on the labor aspect, the female entrepreneurship aspect, or women's access to productive resources. So you can filter all this information. You can also have research by the type of implementation instruments. So did parties agree to reform laws, to cooperate, to share information, to develop a capacity building program? So you can research by this topic. You can of course research by parties, regions. You can filter by parts. So let's say that you're interested in only in the chapter on focusing on trade and gender, then you can select it. Also, and this is something that I think it was extremely important to mention, you cannot just read the provisions of the provisions, only the text, if you don't know if there's a monitoring institution or if the dispute settlement mechanism could be applicable, because it's a package deal. So you need to have the broader picture. So I included these information. So let's have just like 2 examples of what you could look at. So here is the AFCFTA. There's the text of the provisions. Then you click on the plus, on the green plus just beside the title, and you can access all the information you need. So if a subcategories of gender issues is provided, so in this case, it provides for gender equality, so it's not mentioned. the kind of implementation instruments it's provided, the parties, which institution is in charge of reviewing the implementation, is it explicitly excluded from the dispute settlement mechanism? You have all the information about the dates, and I also added some relevant information when it was needed regarding whether it's notified to the WTO. And also, at some occasion, I just put some references to other provisions that are that should be read with the provisions to better understand it. And here we have, for instance, Article 23.9 of the USMCA. In this example, you have specific or subcategories of gender issues. And I added more information regarding the type of gender issues, so equal wage, pregnancy, parental leaves. So all this kind of information will help you actually to better understand the provisions. And in this case, it's not explicitly excluded from the dispute settlement mechanism, but it's applicable to, there's a specific procedures that is applicable to recourse to the dispute resolution. And in this case, parties have to engage consultations, and if it's unsuccessful, they will be able to bring the case in front of the dispute settlement mechanism. So it is online now. It's on the WTO website, so I invite you to have a look, have fun, read the provisions, and if you need additional information, of course, you can definitely reach out to us.
Excellent. Thank you, Lolita. This is very comprehensive and very, very complete month of work, of hard work.
Indeed.
And this is, as Lolita said, this is one-stop source of information that everybody can have access to. So this is something that is available to all. Before we conclude, I think we can go to our Q&A session. So I think we have here in this room possibly some questions from participants, but also I see online we have some questions as well. So maybe I'll give the floor to the floor and maybe if anybody in the room has a question, now is the time. And if you could just present yourself before you ask the question. Thank you.
I'm Indivia from the Village Foundation, South Africa. I just want to talk about the database. It's a fantastic resource that consolidates a lot of information. And the old saying, if you build, they will come. I don't buy that. Having been supporting African entrepreneurs from the ground up over the last 10 years and having been an entrepreneur myself, particularly across the African continent, I guess having built this extraordinary resource, it is so imperative that the people who really need to use it and be armed with this extraordinary information are made aware of it. So I just want you to elaborate on your strategy for actually, marketing this information so that ordinary women from entrepreneurs, etc., are able to access this and then use the extraordinary information that you've assembled for continuing, the pushing for gender equality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we'll answer your question. Lolita, you want to start and then I'll take over?
So yes, the database was first and foremost developed to support members. As the WTO, it's our mandate. But it's also to inform other stakeholders involved in trade. So on the strategy, maybe Anoush would be you could elaborate on the strategy, but I just really want to point out that the objective was really to make information accessible to everyone. So if women can access it to advocate with their government, to plead their case and to ask how this provision is implemented, what is offered to me. So if in this provision, you mentioned that you agreed to cooperate to build a program for capacity building program, let's say, in digital trade for women entrepreneurs. Where are we? This is something that could be useful for women entrepreneurs.
Thank you, Lolita. Just to complement what you just said, so we have in the WTO built a training program for government officials, and this database is part of the program. It's a week-long program. It's very intensive and goes really deeply into this issue of gender equality and trade. As of next year, we're going to work on developing, I would say, a module that would target women entrepreneurs. And the idea would be to have this training module, let's say, to be extremely concrete and in line with the needs of women entrepreneurs. So there's going to be a lot of work gathering the information of the needs of the women entrepreneurs that we want to target, that will be the participants of this training. I won't call it a program yet, because we are a small team, as Ambassador said, and we have a lot already. We've been working a lot on many different issues. So we want to start small with a module that we could integrate maybe in bigger programs that are targeting women entrepreneurs, and then maybe grow from there. But definitely we will include this database as part of this module.
Fantastic, thank you. And I would love to offer our support as you develop the module or the program for women entrepreneurs to use the database.
Ambassador Molokome.
Yes, I just wanted to come in quickly, because I'm going to leave shortly, not because what we're doing is not important, but I have another commitment. But just to thank you very much for the point you raised, because it's absolutely true. And Anush, also in support of what you said, believe me, these are small beginnings here at the WTO. You know, coming from our sub-region, I can imagine that you find this maybe surprising, but don't be too surprised. We are working from the ground. And I believe that these are small beginnings, but also what I wanted to throw in is the fact that there are partners who are working maybe from the IWG point of view, because we also still have our, the International Gender Champions Impact Group, the Trade Impact Group, where we still work with the ITC, the International Trade Organization, just to say that there are other collaborations that we have, and that I know the gender unit here at the Secretariat will be working with to do the kind of thing that, because it is critically important that you don't build white elephants, if whatever you want to call them. You want to make sure people use them. And I think as ambassadors here, Ambassador Chancellor and myself, we are very, very keenly aware that there are shortcomings in our countries, especially in our governments. And this kind of resource, we will rely on us and our lobbying and advocacy in our capitals to make sure that they get used. I just wanted to assure you in that respect and say, we're here and we really appreciate your offer, because as I've already bragged, there's a lot of resources in our region like yourselves who can assist in this respect. Thank you so much. And thank you. This is exciting. And I'm going to slip away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We'll take another question from the floor, and then I'll take a couple of questions online. Yes, Madam, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm Joy Tsent from Africa Women in Trade. We are an independent organization of diaspora, and I wanted to compliment, especially Madam, she's just leaving, and you also mentioned about the Africa has been leading with this. So it's a compliment saying, yes, it is. And Africa Union is also celebrating the African Women Day on 31st of this July. So mark on that one, because we are making that an awareness of African women in trade, because gender is important, and it's good that it's integrated also in the WTO. And yes, it's just a compliment and congratulations for your work. And MSMEs, we are working together as well. And I'm hoping we'll find that link on your program as well, so that will help us to get the women this information. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I didn't know about this African Women Day. That's great. We should celebrate that in the WTO as well. Definitely. I'll make a point. I'll make a note of that. Definitely. So taking questions from the our participants online, there is a question about how provisions in FTAs are subject to dispute settlement or not. So we already have responded to that question extensively, I think, Lolita. Well, you have responded to it, actually. We have maybe a question for you, Ambassador, if you don't mind. Here we have a participant asking that both ambassadors have good experiences with a set of with a setup committee or group that monitors the progress. So basically, referring to the different monitoring mechanisms that is embedded in these agreements. And the question is, what exactly are the elements that make it successful? And do you see binding gender and trade article as the final stage of regional agreements?
Well, thank you very much. It's a good question. As I said before, we think that in the case of this free trade agreement between Uruguay and Chile, the establishment of the committee was a key element to assure that the provisions of this Chapter 14 are implemented. And as I said before, I named here some of the activities that were already taken by the committee when planifying the 2021-2022 activities, which, as you have seen, they are related precisely with the fulfillment of this obligation. So we think this is a key element in assuring that these are not just fine words, but that really we put facts where we put our mouth. And I think that the issue about the binding nature, well, it's a very interesting issue because, as you know, from a point of view of international law, today, well, not today, I mean, since many years ago already, it is said that even unilateral acts that could comply, unilateral declarations, for example, by high officials from states, are binding because are a way of assuming an international commitment. So, to begin with, it's an issue that can be discussed from a juridical point of view. That's I'm also a lawyer, and that's a passionate issue for us for sure. But I would like to say here that, for example, in the case of this agreement, the mood or the intention in Uruguay and in Chile was to establish a kind of, because this is cooperation. I mean, as I said, this committee is also related to the Committee on Cooperation in general terms. So the mood was established, both countries believing in the importance of this gender chapter, in really committed to make it happen. It was a very cooperative and constructive setting for making this provision work. And that's the reason why, for example, regarding eventual doubts regarding these provisions, it was settled a consultation mechanism, because the idea was to continue this positive mood and engagement between our two countries to solve these issues. And as I said before, it was also the intention to take into account some sensibilities that can, I mean, there are different kinds of sensibilities. There are sensibilities that may come from concrete economic sectors within the countries, and there are also sensibilities that may come from NGOs that say that, well, you know, including all these issues that are in the next generation FTAs, in this kind of tools, well, it's to a certain way, make them commodities, no? Commoditization of this issue. So that made us also to move with a certain care in dealing with these issues. I have the privilege also to have within my staff here in my mission in Geneva, one of the negotiators of this agreement from Uruguay, from part of Uruguay. So I don't know, Martin, perhaps if you want to add something on this regard.
Thank you, Ambassador. I have the privilege to be part of the working group and developing this chapter. Actually, Uruguay had the idea to present this chapter to Chile, and Chile was most welcoming. It wasn't a big issue to negotiate it. It wasn't a big challenge. I think that the challenge came from the civil society and some part of it. I think that the dialogue approach that we had when we have problems when interpreting the language on in case that we can face lack of application of the dispositions were solved through mutual and friendly dialogue. That was a big thing for some part of the NGOs in terms that, okay, we are not applying the general dispute settlement of the FTA, and we are recognizing the speciality and the special nature of this social linked matter that benefits trade as well. So in that sense, I think it works both ways. Having an independent chapter on this field, it's totally innovative, at least in our region. That chapter can stand on its own with its own committee that reports to the Committee on Cooperation, but it has its own focal points that are distinctively identified for this particular matter, and that you have written obligations and written ways of fulfilling those obligations, that actually we can see, as the ambassador said, that all the activities taken in 2021 and 2022 were just a copy-paste of those obligations. And that's a good manifestation of the political will that we are facing when implementing this chapter. I think those are the basis of having success when dealing with the next generation issues within an FTA, you know, taking the dramatization of it, make it more accessible, and acknowledging as well some of the issues that Ambassador mentioned before that are not minors, such as the possibility of having a balance between the family and work life, maternity leave, gap between salaries, those issues that were mentioned between commas within this chapter really calm down any commoditization arguments that could be made. That was the solution that we found with Chile. It's not the only way of doing it, of course, but in the upcoming FTAs that Uruguay is part of, we're trying to push forward a chapter on the basis of this one. So thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Martin, for your answers to this question. Maybe I would like to build on both your answers and on this question actually, because and I have a question for you, Lolita. Actually, I was thinking, what remains undone? Actually, what's basically the next steps? Where can we go?
Well, there's a lot that remains undone, or that could be perhaps more strong, like we could see more strong commitments, definitely. There's still a lot of countries that are part of one or two FTAs that contains one or two gender provisions, but like in a list of potential issues that could be addressed by cooperation, but like we see this list with only gender issues. Which gender issues? There's no precision. What do you want to tackle? How do you want to address women's needs with this kind of provision? It's not enough precise. And so what do we need? And I can focus on 2 points. First, if parties could agree to undertake monitoring activities and impact assessment, actually, and gender impact assessment before the conclusion of the treaty. So to assess the needs of women with data, they will be able to tackle these or to address these specific needs and to formulate specific provisions to address this gap. Then after like a couple of years of after the entry into force, they could redo the same exercise, collect data, then again assess how the agreement help or didn't help enough women to be able to seize the opportunities generated by the trade agreements, because a trade agreement is meant to create business opportunities, job opportunities, increase economic growth. We need to have data to be able to assess if it works also for women. So this is the first thing that we could see more. Actually, there's only 2 RTAs that explicitly, and this is binding commitments, to undertake a gender impact assessment. The other, there are other RTAs that address impact assessment, and you will see it in the database, but it's in the cooperation efforts. So it's not the same level of commitment, I could say. And the second thing, and very briefly, so we talked a lot about the figures today, but commitments for gender equality in trade agreements, it has nothing to do with numbers or a quantitative analysis. It's what the provisions mean, what it address, what are the specific action that countries agree to do to effectively support women's participation in trade, but not only participation in trade, but to actually help women increase their living standards so that the trade liberalization benefits to all, including women. Anush, very quickly, can I?
You have half a second.
Perfect. Well, the question is for you. So we discussed a lot about the FTAs, but women's participation in trade is not only about FTAs. There's all these trade policy components. So what remains on that? How can we make trade liberalization work for women with the policy intervention?
Right. So, well, thank you for this question. I didn't expect the question, but I'll take it nonetheless. So, I mean, I think you partly answered your own question, actually. You mentioned the issue of data collection. We don't have enough data on women in trade. And this is as the Ambassador Monokome was saying, this is a key priority for members to enhance this kind of data collection that are focusing on women in trade. And then you mentioned the issue of the provisions, and I would go beyond just the RTAs and the provisions in the RTAs. I would like to talk about the national trade policies that are being implemented and adopted by countries. We could see that there is a link that the provisions are somehow translated in national trade policies, and without the data, as you mentioned, how can you make policies that are informed enough, that can be efficient enough and targeting the needs of women in the right way if you don't know where women entrepreneurs are, in which sector, what are the key issues they are facing or key challenges they are facing, whether it's access to finance or even goes even deeper than that, or knowledge on trade rules, for example. So if you don't know all that, then how can your policy be targeted and effective? And then you mentioned the impact assessment. So that's another aspect. You need to understand, the effectiveness of your policy, how it can help women in reality. What changes does it make on the ground? And then basically we have these 3, let's say, activities. One, the data collection, the policy making, and the impact assessment, but often they are separated from each other. They're not, they're not we need to combine these processes together so that we create this sort of basically a positive influence of all these different processes that can lead to better, let's say, or that can lead to fostering gender equality in trade. If you don't embed in your policy the data aspect or the impact aspect, then you're not engaging yourself in doing that, and then this can be done separately or not, and then the policy is not that well focused. I would assume. I would say it's the same thing with trade agreements. If you don't integrate these two, if you don't combine these three processes, if I may call them like that, then that doesn't support much the impact or the how these provisions or the trade policies can change the lives of women on the ground. So that's possibly one thing to think of. Great. So thank you for that question. Maybe we can conclude. Just maybe a couple of one point on very technical matter. I see questions here about, is the data available to all? It's available to all. We shared the link on the Zoom platform. We will have a news item coming out, so you will also be able to have access to the link directly. And also it's of course free of charge, available to everyone. So it's open source. Anyone in the WTO, outside of the WTO, can have access to this information. Right. So maybe we want to conclude this session. And I will give the floor to Ambassador Gansela.
Thank you very much, Anush. And as it was said by Anush in her presentation, it happens to be also the chair of the informal working group on MIS, besides being the ambassador of Uruguay. So I would like to end up with sharing with you some experience. First, allow me to congratulate the Secretariat for this tremendous job of building these databases. And I know what I'm talking about, because in our informal working group on MIS, we did the same regarding MIS. We made a process of analyzing all their RTAs that contains mentions to MIS. And this last year, we further developed the idea, not just the mention to MIS, but extracting what is said, specifically said in this regard, and classifying this information according to the issues, if you want the theme. So you can go along. And this is a tremendous work. It's an incredible amount of work. So really, I think we have to recognize the labor of WTO Secretariat in this regard. And I have to say that this has been very useful to us in the case of MIS, because, for example, as you know, we work with a quite particular methodology. We don't build rules. We make guidelines or recommendations for members. And we approved a December 2020 package with a set of 6 recommendations and declarations. And, many of the things that we were suggesting to the governments were inspired or taken from this information that was compiled through the different RTAs. So it's also, if you want, a direct way of sharing best practices, because there you can see what others are doing, and you can systematize this information. So I think this is an enormous, powerful tool that you have, and you can make a great use of it as the working group on gender and trade issues. Then, just to mention, because we have female entrepreneurs here, and to a certain extent, we are sister or brothers initiatives, MIS and Trade and Gender, because as a matter of fact, most part of MIS are owned by women. So this, we have too many overlapping areas. Last year, we organized an event together to see precisely these issues. I think some of our members now are also asking for organizing another event, tapping on these overlapping issues, because that's the reality in the field. So, and here I wanted to share with you the information that we have set last year, a platform that is called Trade for MIS, where you can see basically, I mean, the 4 or 5 steps that Amit Smith that wants to go internationally has to follow. That's one chapter. The other chapter is for public policy decision. So the officials can enter there and see what's going on. But one of the most important features of this platform is that it contains the links that you may need to go for any specific issue. There you will find the link to the Global Trade Help Desk. You will find links to everything that has to do with micro, small, and medium enterprises for each of the issues. So that could be also of help for women entrepreneurs, of course. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. This is important, you know, the links between the work that we do on gender and small businesses. That's absolutely crucial. Absolutely. So we're closing this this session, maybe with one announcement, if you allow me. We've talked a lot about impact assessment, and tomorrow, actually, Lolita, Amrita Barry, the WTO chair from Mexico, and myself, we will look at how actually provisions really impact women on the ground. We will make, we are working on this aspect, trying to establish links. And we will have a session tomorrow, session 52. It's the last session of the global review before the closing. So feel free to join us, and we can go deeper together into this issue. Thank you for your participation and your attention. And now this session is closed.